afternoon and welcome to everyone for hopefully what is the first of a long line of co-organized events between the Institute for American Studies of the University of Public Service and the Danube Institute. Here on my left is, too kind, thank you. My name is Balázs Mártonffy. I run the Institute for American Studies at the University of Public Service. I'm a political scientist and I'm glad that you're all here. Thanks so much for taking time out of your Thursday afternoon. It's a busy week, but a short week. And to come listen to us talk about the US midterm elections, potential impact on the US-Hungarian relationship, and all the fun stuff that goes along with it. On my immediate left is István Stumpf. He's the executive director of the Danube Institute, also pursuing a PhD, which hopefully he'll finish soon. Very excited to have him finish that, an Anglo-American issues specialist. On his left is Dreher, senior editor of the American Conservative and the director of the network program of the Danube Institute here in Budapest for at least this academic year. And on my farthest left, last but not least, István Stumpf, former Constitutional Court Justice, former minister, and also a fellow of the Institute for American Studies and the president of the Tokai-Hegyalja University. I think that's the proper title. So many hats, but super excited to have you here. So thanks all of you for being here today. And with that, I think we'll get to our event. Obviously, we're starting off with what's happening next week, November 8th. We know that there's a number of historic patterns as to how congressional elections happen. And we think that as political scientists that most of these patterns tend to happen over and over again. But this one may be special. So my first question goes to István Stumpf, and would you sort of set the scene for us and tell us why midterm elections are important, how they define the US political landscape, and what do you think will happen in this one coming up next week?
Thank you. Well, I think we could talk the whole event about these two questions, basically. But why do they matter? I think a lot of people think they might not matter, but I think that in American checks and balances still, especially the Senate, has a very important role to play. So I think it can check presidential power still pretty effectively. And that's why I think midterm elections still matter, even though if you look at the American political system, usually the turnout rate is much lower or during a midterm than the actual presidential elections, although 4 years ago, actually, it was significantly high. So we will see what happens this year. But I'm expecting a higher participation rate than usual. I don't want to go into lectures about the American political system, so I will talk more about what I think, how the elections will go, and I don't consider myself an election expert, so or a pollster. I'm kind of, how should I say, I'm a bit like the polls go. So I'm going up and down on my expectations for the elections. If you would have asked me in February, I was pretty certain that the Republicans will have a big win. And I was pretty certain of this basically until the beginning of summer, especially until the infamous court ruling on abortion, which seems to have affected the election, at least it looked like in the summer. And the difference between the two parties basically disappeared. And in August, you could even see a lot of polls showing that the Democrats might have a chance to actually keep both houses. But if you look at the new polls now, I'm again more leaning towards a Republican victory, and actually in both houses. I'm still not overtly optimistic for the Republicans, because I think there might be some surprises, but I think they will have a nice majority in the House. I think at least 15 or 20 more congressmen than Democrats, and I think they will have a slight majority in the Senate. I think, or a tie, or 1+ for the Republicans. I think they have. So if you're looking at the polls, especially in the summer, and some of the, I mean, we can talk a bit more about some of the candidates which stirred some controversy, especially like Blake Masters in Arizona or Dr. Ross in Pennsylvania. But if you look at the recent polls, the difference between these candidates actually closed. And sometimes the polls also show that these people are now leading. So I think they have a pretty good chance to pick up Arizona. I think they will get Nevada almost certainly, and I think they have a pretty good chance to get Georgia as well. And I think they will lose Pennsylvania still, but if they get the other three, then I think they might have a good situation, but let's see.
So that's enough to start us off, but I see Rod wants to add something.
Yeah, I just want to add something to what István said, that these midterm elections are enormously important because currently the Congress is Democratic and the president is Democratic. So Biden could get a lot done with those majorities. If they flip over to the Republicans, then Biden is dead in the water for the rest of his term. I mean, he's still got the presidency, he can do a lot, but they can block an immense amount, especially on judges, because the president depends on the Senate to confirm federal judges. Biden filled a lot of federal judiciary vacancies in his first 2 years. But now if the Republicans take over the Senate, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, will almost certainly gum up the works and slow that down. And that is massively important. And and it also sets the stage for 2024, a presidential election year. If the Democrats lose Congress, Biden is going to limp into 2024. You're already hearing some Democrats murmuring out loud that they think he's too old and too feeble to continue to run in 2024. Nobody wants Kamala Harris. She's a very weak candidate. But if the Republicans take the Congress, then the Democrats are going to be very hard-pressed to come up with somebody to replace Biden in 2024, if that could even be done.
Yeah, so we've gotten into the themes of how much is this really a referendum on the president's past job, how well he did this past 2 years, or how much is this about the governors, the congressmen, and the senators themselves? And it's, one peculiarity of the U.S. midterm elections, it's just important to keep in mind that every 2 years, including in this election, the entire lower house, the House of Representatives, gets reelected. And historically, we have seen that usually the parties whose president is in power loses a fair amount of seats in the House, which is what I'm picking up in the theme over here. The Senate is a little more complicated, but usually they lose seats over there as well. What makes this election special, though, is only 1/3 of the Senate gets reelected every 2 years. They're appointed for 6 years, so not the entire Senate is up for reelection, only 1/3 of them, 34 what we call Class 3 senators. And in this case, the Republicans hold more seats, so they have to defend more of their seats while trying to gain some away from the Democrats. And István hinted at some of the key races in Pennsylvania between Dr. Oz and Fetterman, and interestingly in Arizona as well. But I wanted to get back to your point on judges and appointing judges in sort of the three branches of government. And I turn to István Stumpf and his expertise over here. What would you say the major theme, or would you agree with your panelists over here that one of the major themes was about the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade, and what sort of mobilization effect do you think that had on, or will have on, voter turnout?
I think the future of judiciary, and especially the future of Supreme Court, is one of the most important issues of the Biden administration. Just after the election, they tried to change the rule. So that was the very important Judiciary Act, which was passed by the House, but it was not accepted by the Senate. The idea was to increase the number of the Supreme Court members for 5 people, very similarly than Roosevelt tried to do that. But finally, the Senate was not able to accept that, and that was the reason why with the executive order, the Biden decided that he set up the committee, the presidential committee, on the Supreme Court future. So 36 lawyers, professors work on it, provided more than 1,000 pages. I read more than 500. And there was an idea to reduce the term of the justices for 18 years, But finally, and the other ones, this provides opportunity for every president to nominate or to nominate 2 justices. But finally, that kind of report was just a report. It was not able to be the law in the House, in the Congress. But there was the huge discussion and huge debate around the federal judges. And there was a message from the Democrat side that 40 federal judges was by Biden after the election and the first year. And the said was that is the highest number after Ronald Reagan. But you can remember 4 years before, when Clinton, the wife of Clinton, Hillary, asked Obama that not fulfill that kind of federal judge position, and 130 federal justice position was opened, as that's provide opportunity to Biden to send this kind of federal. But about the decision of the Supreme Court, I think yes, it's provide the very hard situation for the conservatives because it was not very popular among most of the people. But I think because the economic situation and the bad economic achievements of the Biden administration very much override that kind of situation, and that's the reason why. And also the unemployment rate is not bad, not so bad, but I think the inflation and the economic things, and also the crime, the increasing number of the crime in the big cities, that's the very bad failure of the whole Biden achievement. And I think that kind of referendum, it's much more about the achievements of the Biden administration and also sending some kind of message to the next election. And very important will be what is going to be in Florida. If Dos Santos will be the winner in the governor race, I think it gives the great chance to be one of the most important candidate for the next election, together with Trump.
Can I just chip in here? I think István touched upon some important topics because what we're discussing in the beginning, so abortion was a pretty high topic in the summer. But if you look at the polls now, it dropped to the 3rd or 4th place. And inflation is now what is most important for most Americans. It's over 30% in most of the polls. And even immigration, and in some polls, even what again István mentioned, crime reform is more important now than abortion. And these 3 issues are usually what people think the Republicans are better at. And actually Biden's favorability is now basically the same as Trump's was, so it's pretty low, which again I think is favoring the Republicans. So we will see, but I think now the trends are kind of supporting them. And you know, it's funny because we're talking about high inflation. It's around 8%, which I think here in Europe we will be happy with 8% of inflation, but that's another topic.
Well, I would say that I was just looking at the new numbers today from Gallup. It shows that the economy is considered to be either extremely important or very important to over 70% of voters. Over 70%. And crime is almost up there. Abortion is hugely important, but almost entirely to Democrats. So with the independents moving on crime and the economy, that is massively in the Republicans' favor. And beyond specific issues, the country is in really bad shape. The way the American people think about the way the country's going, only 17% told Gallup that they believe the country is going in the right direction. That's fewer than 1 in 5. That is going to make this election a referendum on those in power now, which is to say the Democrats in charge of Congress and Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's approval, as István said, is at 40%, which is the second worst for an incumbent in a president in a midterm since 1974. And the Democrats have been desperate to make this an election about abortion rights and about democracy. and about election denial. They've
Election integrity.
election integrity. You know, Biden gave a speech last night in Washington about our democracy is at stake. But they don't really believe this because some of these the Democratic Party funded some of the more extreme Republicans in the primaries, thinking that if we can get these crazy Republicans into the general election, they'll be easy to beat. Well, it hasn't turned out that way. If they really cared about the future of democracy, they wouldn't have taken that chance. But they did, and so they don't.
Before the last election, there was the heavy discussion about how to liberalize the voting rights and using some kind of other type, not just personally voting, but using the posting and the others. And I think this kind of debate and the fighting also continuing and spending the huge money to the advocator to try to give the voting rights for the illegal citizens, illegal immigrants. That was an idea that more than 100 million people could get the citizenship and the voting rights. Is that true? I just wondering, because there was another original idea of Biden administration to open the gate for the illegal and give the citizenship and the voting rights, because this is the possible support.
Well, in the state of Oregon on Tuesday, there is a question on the ballot for the voters to decide, do we give voting rights to people who are illegal aliens? This is going up for a vote of the people. I mean, it's insane to think about it, but this is the kind of thing that I think is driving a lot of the psychological push in this election, is people's fear that things have gotten out of control. There's a good piece today on Barry Weiss's Substack about how in Los Angeles, very Democratic city, there's a mayor's race between a black congressman, Karen Ross, I think her last name is, Karen Bass, and this businessman, Rick, his last name escapes me now, but anyway, he's a kind of a Trump figure, but he's a Democrat, barely a Democrat, but a Democrat, an independent outsider. He's got a lot of support from Hollywood liberals and Los Angeles liberals who are sick and tired of the crime and the homelessness taking over their city. And so, and Democrats can't stand against it because they're so bound by wokeness and by their commitments to woke activists. We were talking about abortion a second ago. In the state of Arizona, a very libertarian state, the Democrats are riding high this summer after the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade. But Planned Parenthood, which is the big pro-abortion provider and big pro-abortion political funder, they went heavy to promote the Democrat running for state senate. Well, guess what? The Republicans found out that Planned Parenthood had signed something 2 years ago after the George Floyd mess, committing Planned Parenthood to defunding the police. The Republicans pounced on that, and they've attacked the Democrats, saying, these pro-abortions want to defund the police. We've seen the Democratic advantage go straight down. This intersectionality, which is huge for the woke, demanding that everybody has to be on the same far left position on every issue, is really going to cost the Democrats.
So extremely interesting, and you guys are making my job so easy. Thank you so much. I may just have to throw in a question and it's just taken all away. But let's stick back, because I do want to pick up on what Rod said specifically, and I can continue with your Arizona example. And what I've picked up from all three of you is that the Democrats want to make this election not about Biden, about democracy, however they interpret democracy, and about some infringements upon some rights, specifically women's rights and abortion, and not where that should rest, but sort of the infringement itself. Those are the Democrats. The Republicans would like this to be a referendum on economy, inflation, and all the things the Biden administration did wrong. But I think the most interesting portion of the American voting population are the independents. And if we look at Arizona, just following on Rod's example, we see that currently the Republican candidate for governor is leading 51, 52, 53% polling, likely to be elected. And a Democrat for the Senate race is currently in the lead. So I'm guessing Democrats are likely to lean Democrat and Republicans are likely to be Republican. So what explains that variation are the independents. So what I would like to ask you, and sort of open-ended to the question, we understand what issues are important for the Republicans, what issues are important for the Democrats. But for the roughly 15% of the US populace who self-register as independent, what would you say the key themes of this election are?
Well, if you look at the polls, it's pretty obvious that they are leaning Republican. So what Rod mentioned as well, most people, even independents, look at the economy and inflation as the most important topics. And going back to Arizona, I think it's going to change a bit what Rod was saying, because the Libertarian candidate actually stepped back a couple of days ago for Blake Masters. So I think that a couple of percent will most likely go to the Republican candidate, and that might change the Senate race, not just the governor race. But I think mostly, if you look at the polls, you can see that most of the independents are now actually looking at the economy, where the Republicans actually do better. And if you look at the polls again, most people will say that they favor Republican if it's about the economy.
So
if it's about abortion,
stupid, like Bill Clinton earlier said.
yes,
right?
but I mean, we're in a process of potentially a global crisis, economic crisis. So I think it's kind of understandable that most people, if you look at inflation or higher gas prices, they will think that something is not going in the right direction. And then again, faced by some of the issues the Democrats are pushing, which are not necessarily very important for everyday life, like intersexuality. But I think they will see that paying more for your car's gas or for your overhead, that's a bit more important than transgender bathrooms.
Well, and crime too. I mean, crime has gone through the roof since the summer of Floyd. Crime is mostly handled at the state and local level, but the tone that is set at the national level is really important. Joe Biden and the Democrats jumped with both feet forcefully on the anti-police, woke prosecutor, George Soros prosecutors in different cities that have been very soft on crime. And it has really blown up in their faces. In my hometown back in Louisiana, the capital city, for the first time, according to a police source I know, for the first time, crime has gotten into every part of the city. It hasn't been confined just to the impoverished center. This is something nobody has seen before. Is this Joe Biden's fault? No, probably not. But Joe Biden and the Democrats have a very liberal take on crime, and people quite rightly understand that this is what is driving, at the local level, politicians and those who run the police departments to pull back.
I think if the election campaign not dominated one major issue, I think the retrospective economical vote will be the major influence of the voting behavior. That's happening now. So I think the Democrats tried to use the abortion issue. The Supreme Court decision helped a little bit. But I think the economical situation, the crime, and also the personality of the president himself, sending the message that he is not a capable man, and the Democrats not able to support him and try to identify themselves from Biden, because Biden not a strong personality, not help during this midterm election. So that's the reason why I think the economic situation and the retrospective analysis of the people, of the voters, will be the final point of the decision.
Extremely interesting. So we have, it'll be a referendum on the past 2 years of Biden, but also Biden's trying to limit his own seepage into individual races because his unfavorability ratings are so high, his approval ratings are so low. And we also are talking about what does this mean for 2024. So let's stick with the past 2 years and the referendum over here. And then we've touched upon some things that you said were not Biden's fault, but Harry S. Truman said, the buck stops here. There's certain things you can say it's not the president's fault, but fundamentally, even within an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch over seepages and power sharing relationship, people like to find someone to be at fault, even if he's not at fault. So the past 2 years of the Biden administration, just a little retrospective, and I turn to István because we haven't heard from him in a little while. What would you say the greatest successes and the greatest failures of the past 2 years of the Biden administration were, which are still heavily on people's mind?
Well, I think it started hard for him, so he couldn't really pass most of his plans. I mean, it depends on who you think of what is a success and what is a disaster. I myself don't really see that much success, but of course I'm leaning conservative, so I think I see more things which I'm not supportive, and that's why I think it's not successful. But if you're a Democrat, I think passing the Green Deal could be seen as a success. But other than that,
No, he passed this big stimulus package.
yes.
But he passed that over the advice of Larry Summers, only one of them. He was a Democrat and a top, financial guy. I think he was Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, because he said this is going to be inflationary. But Biden and the Democrats passed it anyway, and now inflation has gone through the roof. So I think that you could look at that as a success in the sense that it's something Biden passed over the objections of Republicans, but now it has been
But economically, it's not necessarily a success.
right. And I feel the same way about his Ukraine policy, but we can get into that.
But the relative low unemployment rate also, I think it's an important thing. And also so many Americans vaccinated in time or not time. It's a very controversial issue.
But you could say that a lot of these things Trump started, actually. I mean, the vaccination program and also the low employment.
Okay, but they try to sell this is their achievement. And also, I think that was the infrastructure bill, which tried to get the huge money to reorganize the whole highway system and the others. So that's also was very important as an achievement.
But the COVID hasn't come up a lot, as far as I know, in the direct discussions about the election. But there is an immense amount of anger among the American people about the way our government handled the COVID crisis. And the way the media handled it, where you couldn't talk about the lab leak. That was disinformation. To talk about the lab leak hypothesis, that is the idea that it could have come from a lab in Wuhan. No, you couldn't talk about that. We had to trust the science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now people are there's this huge backlash against all kinds of authority, but especially the government and the media for the way they managed that narrative. The other day, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly, an important center-left magazine, talking about how we need to have a COVID amnesty for all those people who pushed too hard. They meant well, let's just get past it. I think a lot of people, when they go to vote on Tuesday, whether that's front to mind or not, that's going to be in their minds, just anger at the authorities for the way they handled this.
But I think, for example, in Florida, it's going to be an interesting question, because DeSantis was very kind of liberal, so to speak, on fighting COVID, and it seems it was successful. So Florida is doing very well.
Liberal in what sense?
That he said you don't need, in the traditional sense, so you don't need masks, you don't need vaccine mandates. So he was pretty relaxed on COVID mandates, and I think the state did wonderfully. So if you look at the GDP growth, investment coming in, so basically not closing down the state was good economically for the state.
By American standards, that means he was conservative. It was the liberal states that were the most.
I'm just saying that.
And then maybe we can leave the classical liberal interpretations of liberal debate a little behind, or for the after situation over here. Okay, so what I've heard is a number of failures.
The withdrawal Afghanistan, this is one of the most important failure. And also, I think the inflation, this could be the second one. And I am talking about that he was not able to increase the number of the Supreme Court member as well. So he was not able to change the whole judiciary system. I think if you look at the situation, the 6-3 is also the issue of the Democrats, and I think it's provide the opportunity for the conservatives in the next future.
And real quick, I think that we're going to see next week at this time, pundits will be talking about another failure as Biden and the Democrats are losing Hispanics. Mm-hmm. Hispanics used to be strongly in the Democratic camp, but they've been trending under Trump. They started to trend to the right. I think the whole issue of crime is making a huge impact on them. You're starting to see conservative candidates from the Texas border area, which are all Hispanic areas, but they're now starting to elect or getting close to electing Republicans. because it turns out that Hispanics in South Texas on the border want there to be a closed border too, or they want a lot more immigration restriction. This is something that doesn't figure into the planning of Democratic strategists, but it's happening. And also the whole issue of race and diversity, equity, that sort of thing. A lot of Hispanics are starting to second guess the Democratic dogma on these issues.
But it's very, very interesting that never ever appointed so many women and colored people as a federal justice. That's happened. That could be the message to those people who supported before the Obama and the other camp, but it was not enough because the economic issue was overcome.
István, anything, or can I continue?
No, I mean, I wasn't sure because you might have a question purposely on foreign policy, but István brought it up, and that's why I just wanted to say, because I think his foreign policy was actually catastrophic. So a lot of people were hoping for Biden coming in and being this normal, decent guy, because Trump was seen as this flamboyant, a bit crazy person who destroyed a lot of, how should I say, clout for Americans in the international arena. But I think Biden did even worse. I mean, now we're hearing reports that Iran might be attacking Saudi Arabia. I think Chinese-American relations have never been so bad. The Ukrainian war, Afghanistan. So I think that was really a disaster.
Just one other failure. There was an expectation that Kamala Harris could replace him in the middle. But it's, I think nobody's thinking right now that he's able to replace Biden.
Right,
now
I think
or
her ratings are even lower than Biden's, or sort of she's been taken off the narrative campaign over here. Yes, I think, given all fairness, they'd say that a decoupling from Chinese supply chains, the CHIPS Act, would be successes that the Biden administration could point out, and we can get to why they are. And I think fundamentally from the US's perspective that Ukraine hasn't crumbled yet, and Russia is losing a fair amount of manpower and resources over there and being softened up, depending on how you will. From a U.S. perspective, that's definitely something. And then
what I think more on the Russians, I think, than the Americans, but.
Right, but I think anyone who claims success is always, how can I tailor this the best to suit my needs? And then obviously the Inflation Reduction Act is a complex issue. It doesn't reduce inflation, we know that, but it does provide a $3 subsidy for a kilo of hydrogen production, and that signals to me at least, in some sort of energy security broadly sense, they're getting that the next thing might be hydrogen. So I would, just balancing it out as a moderator, I'd suggest that those things are important to keep in mind. Foreign policy, and then you brought up Ukraine, and you brought up the difference between Trump and Biden, which definitely exists in style. In substance, that's a different question. So I think I'll turn to Rod over here, because definitely we can't ignore the war that's ongoing on our borders. Would you say that Biden could have averted this war had Trump been in power? Because there are interesting narratives here in Hungary about what different presidents could have done over there. But how much do you think the movement space of the U.S. administration was in the past year and a half sort of deterring possible Russian attack?
No, I think the Biden administration really screwed up on the Ukraine-Russia thing. As I recall, leading up to what became the Russian invasion, Secretary of State Blinken gave Ukraine big assurances the U.S. would stand behind you. And Russia sent some pretty clear messages about this is a red line, this is a red line. We want you to say Ukraine won't go into NATO. And Biden said no to all of that. He would not deal with the Russians. I'm not blaming Biden for the Russia's invading. That was Russia's fault. They shouldn't have done it. But we have to, I take the Mearsheimer view, Professor Mearsheimer's view, that we in the West had a lot to do with that by foolishly pushing Ukraine towards NATO and by refusing to see that Russia has legitimate security needs or security concerns about having a NATO member, Ukraine, right on its border. So I think that Biden has probably carried out a bad policy as well as it could be carried out, because he has executed a policy that's popular with the entire national security foreign policy blob in Washington. The great problem that we're going to see with this is going to come this winter. As far as I've been able to tell, the American people have no real idea how much Europe is suffering. People in this country and many other countries are suffering right now and will suffer this winter from the war and what it's done with energy. I think what's happening right now, and we'll see this much more clearly at the end of the winter, is the US policy is creating a lot of anti-American sentiment in Europe.
Just to chip in quickly, I think it's also that the Russians sensed weakness. So I think it's not happen chance that the Crimean crisis happened under a Democrat president. And again, what happened after Crimea? Basically nothing. So I think that if there would have been the same, let's say, international uproar during the Crimea, then we would not have the situation now. But that's, of course, a completely different topic. But also, what we mentioned, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was a disaster. I think the Russians rightly thought that we have a Democrat in the system. During the Crimea, they never really did anything, and look at what they did in Afghanistan. America is weak; they just don't have the stomach to really oppose us. So I think that was also what kind of perhaps helped Russia think that they can get away with this. I don't think they would have dared to do this. I mean, I know you said this is a popular fancy in Hungary, but I also agree with this, but I don't think they would have attacked Ukraine during Trump, because Trump was just too unpredictable.
I am not the favor of the conspiracy theory, but I can imagine that several people thinking about that the Biden personally and the Biden administration has a very clear personal interest, Ukraine, because the Biden son, and other not very well-defined situation, which was during the Trump administration, which is also providing some kind of impeachment procedure against Trump. So it's a very important issue and personally touched Biden, and the Biden probably was not able very much to clarify the situation with his son and his personal involvement in this business. I wouldn't like to go much more deeper, but it is also the part of the sentiment, how the people thinking about, not just here in Europe, but in the US as well, especially among the Republicans.
So I think we've heard sort of, I would say, a realist understanding of what's going on. It's a NATO story. The fundamental decision by the Ukrainian government to enter into their constitution that they will join NATO in the summer of 2021, then the strategic partnership between the US and Ukraine in the fall of 2021, Russia's vital national security interests sort of tell the external legitimate vital national security interest lead, which was ignored. The realist story, obviously liberal and constructivist paradigms of international relations would tell another story, and more about the EU story, that this is a values-based argument, but that's not something we could get into. What I do want to get into, which is interesting, of course, and pertinent to our discussion over here, is whether this policy would change if this or other policies, foreign policies, would change if the Republicans do retake the House and the Senate, as is what I was sort of being able to gather from you three, expected come next week.
Yeah, I think it will change, not a lot, because the Ukraine war has had a lot of bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. But I think what we'll see is the Republicans in Congress tightening the purse strings on the Biden administration. I think they'll be less free to spend on aid for the Ukrainians. I also saw just today before I came over a new Wall Street Journal poll showing 48% of American conservatives think that the U.S. is doing too much for Ukraine. So I don't think that U.S. policy will change a lot initially, but the days of Ukraine having a blank checkbook to spend are probably going to be over, and I'm glad of it.
Probably giving much more room for maneuvering and moving toward the negotiated type of achievements, not just expanding the conflict, military conflict. So I think that should be the result of this.
tend to agree. I think if it will change because of two factors. One, what you mentioned, the American population getting sick and tired because of the economic situation. But I think more importantly, which again you mentioned, was the Europeans. So let's see what happens during the winter and how we will survive without Russian gas. So I think if the Ukrainian policy will change significantly, it will change because of the hard realities and not because of who's sitting in Congress.
Yeah, you know, I saw the New York Times the other day. I was wondering, how are they going to report the European energy crisis? Because it's been conspicuously off the pages of the major American media. Well, the Times had a piece this week saying everything's basically fine. Europe's got everything settled for the winter. Let's just sit back and wait for it. I don't believe that's true. I think that this is all part of the media seeing what they want to see to manufacture consent for the continuation of the war among the American people. I think that I hope it doesn't come to this, but if we start seeing pictures of people dying, people freezing to death in Europe, we see people in the streets and European capitals marching and even rioting because they're sick of being cold and hungry, and they want to know why their government, in order to follow Washington's policies, impoverished them, caused them to lose their jobs, and caused them to go hungry, then I think that we're going to see a dramatic about-face in Washington about this war, and there'll be a greater push for peace negotiations. I certainly hope so.
And and I think fundamentally the question of Russia's role in the European security architecture has to be reevaluated. And as I think you all pointed out, it's not just the facts on the ground that no longer support the current modus operandi, but the incorrect perceptions of facts on the ground by other states and other populations sort of complicate this situation where I'm sort of a pessimistic realist over here. I don't think this is going to be solved anytime soon. And by solved, I mean either de jure or de facto. So I don't see any quick solutions. But the question mainly was, so this is one policy that could be changed, given or sort of softened, purse strings, more caveats attached, more brought to the limelight into the US public, that how much this is costing you as a taxpayer, which the Biden administration hasn't done too much to do. What other policies do you think would change significantly? We brought up energy, and we saw the Biden administration's unsuccessful policy to sort of get Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis back on board. Do you think there'll be a change with and you mentioned the possible Iranian act on Saudi Arabia, do you think there'll be a change in the US foreign policy vis-a-vis other regions, not just Ukraine? Or Ukraine is on everyone's mind and we can get to that and let's focus on other issues?
I don't think there's going to be I mean, you can even argue that there wasn't a huge shift since Trump, basically. So it's still Russia and China. They did try to do a new Iranian deal, and I think there's talks about that, but depending on how things go with Iran, that might be dead in the water. But I don't really think there's going to be a huge change in foreign policy. I don't really expect.
It depends on what China does with Taiwan.
That's
frankly.
true.
And just coming off of the Chinese Communist Party Congress, where Xi Jinping consolidated his power and sounded more threatening, that could be, and we don't know what they're going to do. I mean, that could change very quickly, but I think Taiwan is probably going to dominate, along with Ukraine, the foreign policy of the next 2 years.
The perception is very important. If you had a strong man who is managing the country, I think those people who are trying to conflict with you, I think they are expecting that there is the leadership capability. Right now, my perception is that Biden is not a strong leader, but behind him, there is the hidden state. I wouldn't like to say any stronger things, but people behind him maneuvering and managing the whole conflict, and nobody knows what is the real equilibrium behind the scene. That's the reason why the American system is very much based on the president. And the executive power, how to behave the executive power depends on the president capability and also the personality. So that's the reason why this kind of election, the midterm election, much more about the future president as well, not just the past achievements.
So I think we've reached the nice segue into who will that person be. And I think we'll start with Rod and sort of take your thoughts on the midterms coming up. But we know that this is at least in part a referendum on 2024. Let's start with the perhaps usually on political science terms, the thankfully easier term. An incumbent president usually is not challenged by his own party. But do you think that Biden can run again? Will his party let him? Or what do you think of his chances on the Democratic side for 2024?
Well, the Democrats have a disaster ahead of them, even if things don't go as bad as we think for them on Election Day, because Biden, as István was saying, he's not capable of doing his job. I don't know how often it gets passed around in Hungary, but almost every day there are new clips of him speaking things that just aren't true. He said his son died in Iraq. No, he didn't. He said that he got his start at a historically black college or university. No, he didn't. I mean, just crazy things like that he says, and he loses his place when he's talking. So
I was laughing because actually the liberal media was kind of hinting that these are just told stories because he's this big storyteller, so he's not getting,
Right. Well, anyway, he is not fit to govern. George F. Will, one of the most important conservative columnists who hates Trump, said the Democrats need to get rid of both Biden and Kamala Harris, who's a joke, so they can save the country from the restoration of Trump. So I think if the Democrats really wanted to do best for 2024, they would find a way to get rid of Biden and Harris, tall order, but especially because she is a woman of color, and that's going to blow things up for them. But Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, would probably be their strongest candidate. And I would love to see a Newsom-DeSantis race in 2024. There would be two capable governors with true clashes of vision.
Extremely interesting. On the Democratic side, before we turn to Republican?
Yeah. On Democratic side, it's very interesting that the Democrats was not able to provide the possible candidate for the next presidential election. That's the reason why they invited Barack Obama to participate in the midterm election campaign. It's very interesting that why they are not able to build up the new personality, which could be much more capable leader than Biden. That's an interesting question, and I do not think that in the final period they are not able to do that but I think it will be too late.
No, I have to agree. I mean, I personally don't really see anybody who could be a good candidate from their side. So yes, the California governor could be. That's the only person the media is talking about, and he has the only charisma, I think, to carry. But other than that, I mean, Pete Buttigieg could be, perhaps. I'm not sure if America is ready for a homosexual president, but he has charisma, so at least that's bad.
Who is this?
Mayor Pete.
Mayor Pete?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, compared to Biden and a lot of others, at least he has some charisma, so.
Right, and then we did not mention Bernie Sanders or some of the more establishment candidates that can come up. So let's turn to the easier, at least from a political science angle, side, the Republican side, as we sort of have two major names. Both have been brought up, Trump and DeSantis. Anyone else you'd like to add, or who do you think may be the big next guy?
It's going to be Trump or DeSantis. And frankly, I would like to see DeSantis. I was at the National Conservatism Conference recently in Florida. We heard Governor DeSantis speak for an hour, and I think most people in that room, not all, but most people in the room thought this should be our guy in 2024 because he believes in a lot of the things Donald Trump believes in, but he's also young and effective. He knows how to legislate. They won't have any of this crazy tweeting drama that we had with Trump. Most people I talked to there thought DeSantis should be the guy, but almost everyone I talked to there said, but he can't beat Trump in the primary because Trump has such a lock on a key core of the Republican Party. So I would hate for there to be a Trump-DeSantis battle for the nomination, but I think we might get that.
I am agreed with Rod. So I think we are very much approaching that. That if the scandal is going to increase around Trump, I realized that the Chief Justice Roberts just stopped that kind of investigation, which was the tax relief or something like that, before the midterm election. But after the midterm election, probably these things is going to be, and this is not a very good atmosphere for increasing the campaign on the Republican side. So that's the comparative advantage, that disadvantage of Trump. But yes, Trump has a huge influence to the voters, and it's very much depend on who is going to support he.
I also have to agree, but
As I said, this is a fairly clear field.
Yes, but my fear is that we did attend the National Conservatism Conference, and I think that's more of a crowd for Ron DeSantis. But we did also attend CPAC, and I'm not sure if you remember that there was a CPAC poll, and the participants of CPAC said, I think like it's 90% that Trump should run, and the second best option was, yes, Ron DeSantis. But if Trump is in the ballot, I'm afraid that he will win, because what you're saying, he has this charisma and momentum. And also I think my feeling is, but of course I'm not an expert, I was a big Ted Cruz fan in 2016. I was hoping he will win, but of course that didn't happen. And I see him now, I mean, DeSantis, as a new Ted Cruz.
Well, the problem with Trump is
I agree, Trump is problematic. I'm just saying that with the average populace, he's still very...
Okay, but the thing is, as much passion as Trump generates on the conservative side, he generates an equal and opposite passion on the Democratic side. So I think that all things considered, the only Republican the Democrats could beat for president in 2024 would be Donald Trump. Now, I think that the great disaster for our country would be if we had a Trump-Biden rematch. Talk about the sick man of the world if we had to choose between these two elderly people.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with this. And I myself, because I was a Ted Cruz fan, now I'm a Ron DeSantis fan. I'm kind of skeptical if he can win the primaries if Trump is
right. So we get down to, can we avoid, or can the Republican Party avoid a clash of egos in the primaries, which would hurt them, a Trump-DeSantis ego match, and then the more ambivalent and the less polarizing choice, given all three demographics, would be Ron DeSantis, but we can't ignore President Trump's potential bid again. And obviously a joint ticket, a DeSantis-Trump ticket is something that's just a joke that I can make up, because those two egos would never fit. All right, so let's keep on continuing with the Trump administration's relations around the world, and I think we've reached that point of the conversation where we should turn to the Hungarian and the Central European angle and see what things mean and how a democratic administration approaches the region and Hungary differently. And let's start sort of with the region, broadly speaking. It was often said that the Trump administration had a special place in their heart for Central Europe. Whether that was true or not, or whether that was made out of interest or values or some other senses is a different question. But would you say, and I think we'll start with István on my left over here, would you say that the Biden administration attached the same focus to Central Europe that the Trump administration did?
Well, it's difficult to say, because if you think of Ukraine, then yes. But I think before Ukraine, no. I know Ukraine is not Central Europe, but although broadly speaking, I think there's some people who might put even Ukraine into Central Europe. But Ukraine, of course, makes this region much more important than previously. I think he didn't really want to deal with that much with this region, so I think Trump was more enthusiastic. It's interesting because I think during Obama, it was all about the Pacific. So the Middle East wasn't very important, Europe wasn't really important, I mean, Africa was never important, I'm sorry to say that. It was all about the Pacific, and that kind of failed because it didn't pass. I mean, the economic agreement, what was the TTP, yes. And when Trump came in, I think Trump focused a bit more on the usual topics. So of course, China was still important, so the Pacific was still there. But he did recognize that Europe could be interesting because of still the Russian influence. But also he put more emphasis on the Middle East. And I think the Abraham Accords were actually pretty successful. So I think he looked more traditionally on some of the foreign policy issues. And I think Biden coming back was again more Obama 2.0, so more on the Pacific region and not caring that much about Europe. And of course, you're saying special relationship. I mean, during the presidential election, Biden was basically saying that Hungary and Poland are these authoritarian states almost. So that didn't really bode well, I think, for the for the region and Biden's relationship. And again, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but if you look at the recent ambassador, I'm not sure that's also something which is really going in the direction of mending relations between Hungary and America, let's say.
Yeah, I think that I agree with what István said, but I think one of the most interesting things to happen in the last year and a half is the bid that Hungary has made, and Prime Minister Orbán has made, to associate himself so closely with President Trump and with the American conservative movement. I think this was smart because the liberals will always hate Hungary and Poland as long as there are populist governments here. I think that we have seen for sure the profile of Hungary raise greatly on the American right. It delighted me last autumn to go to the National Conservatism Conference. This was almost a year ago, after Tucker Carlson came here and put Hungary on the radar of American conservative activists. I ran into to a Hungarian from Washington there who worked in the embassy, and she said, "This is the weirdest thing and the most wonderful thing to go to an international conference, and when someone says, 'Where are you from?' and I say Hungary, they don't start yelling at me. They want to know, 'Tell us more about your country.'" So I think that things are going to be looking up for Hungary the more the Republicans move closer to power. Certainly if they get back in the White House, things are going to be very good for Hungary, I think.
Talking about the new European American politics, I think there are the relatively hidden process. Under the umbrella of the war, we can realize that the US would like to build up some kind of new moderate power in the center of Europe. This is Poland. So they support it heavily, not just politically, but militarily as well. So they would like to see, instead of Germany, they would like to see some kind of moderate power nearby the Russian Empire. And I don't know what will be the final result of the Ukraine war, but I can imagine that Poland could get much more important role to reorganize the European map than we can imagine before.
Interesting. So, broadly speaking, we've seen, and I think one of the key points to keep in mind is that the U.S. Department of Defense sort of 15 years ago was planning on having the capability of fighting two major theater wars at once, 20 years ago or so. That has decreased to 1.5 on paper, and it's sort of clear to most military experts that that's basically one in reality. And when we brought up Taiwan and we brought up turning to the Pacific, but fundamentally, and you brought up raising up Poland as sort of this middle power stuck between Russia and the US. But fundamentally, I think what most observers would say is that the US cannot fight two wars at once. And one would argue, or some could argue, that the reason we're seeing North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles flying over US allies in the Pacific, the reason we're seeing increased Iranian influence and assertive actions in the region is to sort of split the US's attention going away from the Ukraine into different areas at once. And you brought up, the sort of continuation of US foreign policy turning towards the Pacific and realizing that China is its peer or near peer competitor. But I think, given from a European perspective, that's clear for all of us. The question for us is, what does that mean? Do you leave us behind? Do you leave Europe behind? Do you sort of try to prod up middle powers and pick a power, Germany, who is increasing its defense expenditure? But the fundamental question from my perspective from the US side is, do you trust any of your allies, and to what degree do you trust them to build them up over here? No real question. I just wanted to add that in there.
Well, yeah, I want to add factor two that we haven't talked about, and that it's looming out there, and I think it's going to be increasingly important. The U.S. military is having a lot of trouble meeting its recruitment goals. Serious trouble. We have an all-volunteer military, but after 20 years at war, people are starting to not want to go into the military because There could be a variety of reasons, but I'm hearing from my conservative friends, I hear from people all the time too who write to me, people who are in the military now or who just left the military, saying that the wokeness that the senior military leadership has taken on to try to make the military a woke experiment is driving conservatives out. It seems crazy to think that the military, whose point is to win wars, has gone woke, but that is, in fact, is what has happened. I was talking to a senior member of the military who recently retired, who told me that this is affecting our readiness. And he retired early because he said, I couldn't do anything about it. The military has become that politicized to the left. And I think that this is going to, if these trends continue, it is going to greatly affect readiness and is going to have an effect, of course, on U.S. allies too in Europe.
I'll open it up to the audience in just a few minutes. I have one last question, hopefully bringing back us to the midterm elections and your prognosis, so you can prepare on that end. But what I'm hearing over here is that and what Rod brought up and mentioned, that the vision of what America should be differs greatly between the Democrats and the Republicans. And you brought up Governor Newsom being able to articulate sophisticatedly, if I can say so, that vision, and Governor DeSantis arguing or demonstrating some sort of vision, which is a different vision, but also sophisticatedly. And then President Trump has the charismatic appeal and the way to attract voters to turn out. So how that comes out is going to be an interesting thing. Last question before we open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, get ready with them, is what's the final verdict? House, Senate, next week, who wins? Easy, short. István.
The Republicans are going to overtake the Congress 2 houses.
Okay, Rod?
A red wave, for sure.
I said in the beginning, I think the House is pretty certain, and I think the Senate is either tied or won majority for the Republicans.
And will we know already on November 9th, or will this going to be an extended legal battle as some of the more Democrat-leaning early voters and mail-in voters are still being counted?
There will be the final result. I think there will be the big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. That's the reason why they are not willing to spend too much money for the lawyers.
Yeah, I think we'll know. We'll have a pretty clear idea. There could be some dispute in certain local races, but I think the overall picture will be clear on that night.
Okay, well,
I'm a bit more skeptical. I think some Senate races might be attacked.
He's the conservative.
Well, he's the Hungarian conservative. I'm pessimistic.
Yes, I am. I mean, I was very pessimistic with the Italian elections, the Israeli elections as well. I mean, when I see these people being in power and successful, then I'm believing it's happening. But before that, I'm always kind of skeptical. So I think let's see what goes in the end. But I think it's a good sign that I think now they are even thinking that they perhaps will lose in New York, and they're now putting a lot of money into the New York race as well, I think.
Really?
Yeah. So I think there's some pretty good news, but let's see.
I have to say before we go to the audience that I think one of the most important race next week is the Ohio Senate race, where J.D. Vance is the Republicans against Tim Ryan. Ohio is a red state. J.D. Vance is a political newcomer. You might know his book, Hillbilly Elegy. They made it into a film. I think he's important.
On Netflix of all places.
On Netflix of all places, yeah. J.D. is a fascinating guy. He's under the age of 40, and he's very Trumpy in the best possible sense. He believes in class and talking about class and class conflict in American life, which is not something you hear from Republicans usually. He was raised poor, working class, and I think that being as young as he is and having the vision that he does, he is going to be a formidable figure. I think he's going to be U.S. president one day, frankly. But I would like to see people on the Republican side become more of a working class party and more of a populist party. It's been moving that way since Trump, certainly, but I think J.D. Vance is the next generation of that. He will solidify it if he wins, and I think he will win.
So that's a clear vision, what we heard from Rod Dreher for the America. Are you on the ballot somewhere, or you're here with us? All right, let's turn that up to the audience. If you have any questions, I think there's an extra mic somewhere, or I'm looking around. If there's an extra mic, no, then just please stand up and speak loudly and eloquently. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Ferenc Sullivan, I'm from MCC. Rod talked about the backlash in many areas of many pockets of American life, but I don't see that translating into action, political action and political programs, because what we see now is that this election could go both ways. And the situation in which America finds itself in at present is, in my view, it's flawed in so many areas. I mean, violent crime is not only through the roof, it's also so disturbingly depraved and deranged in many cases. Think of New York subway attacks, think of Bibles being torn up in the street and eaten by people. There's the mental health crisis, which is a disaster, and it's getting worse, and one could continue for hours. And what I see is that it's not translating into a coherent dissent or anger, it's not translating into a coherent program or action. So I'm interested in your take on why is that happening, why isn't that happening?
I think that's a fantastic observation, and it makes me realize that the Republicans, if they do get power and they just sit back and rest on the idea that we're not woke like the Democrats, then they're going to deserve to lose next time. Because I'd rather vote for the unwoke guy than the woke guy, but I also want to see action taken against these doctors and hospitals that are doing surgeries on minors, mutilating sexually these children for transgenderism. I would like to see action taken against biological males playing in women's sports and all the other things you've said. I think the energy is there for this sort of thing, but the energy has mostly been coming from activists like Chris Rufo, who's one of the most important conservatives in America, like Tucker Carlson, drawing attention to it. But you don't see many actual Republican politicians talking about that. And I think the reason is they are terrified, absolutely terrified of being called bigots by the media and by offending big business. But I think the Republicans have got to get over that fear and actually come forward with a positive, substantive policy, set of policy initiatives to push back on this madness.
But isn't that Ron DeSantis? So I think he's doing a wonderful job in Florida. I mean, but I think you and Melissa told me don't say gay bill, but I'm not sure what is the actual name of the bill. But so I'm just using this.
It's a very weak version of what they passed.
I know,
here.
but it's still it's significant, and I think in the American context it's.
It's great. I'm loving it. Go on.
I think in the American context it's a huge success, and he even took Disney. So I mean, that's wonderful.
About.
I mean, who dared to attack Disney?
Yeah,
he
exactly.
Did. So
Mickey Mouse is a pervert. We know that.
So I think, I mean, if he would run, I mean, I think, and Rufo is giving advice to him. So I think he has a good team, hopefully, and I think he could get things done if he's elected.
He's at the state level, though. You're right about that. I think DeSantis would actually do something. It was completely unheard of for any Republican to attack big business, woke capitalism, especially Disney in the state of Florida. Yet Ron DeSantis had the stones to do it. That's one of the reasons I love that guy.
Great. So I saw another hand, and go right ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I just wonder what the panel's thoughts are on the Senate race in Pennsylvania, in Fetterman and Oz. And I'm just so confused. What's the appeal of Fetterman? When I looked at his debate, I don't know if you remember me last week or the week before, it looked absolutely awful. And I just don't know exactly what's the appeal. So if anyone has any idea what's the appeal of Fetterman, he just looks so weak and give a sense of whether or not he's losing in the polls or what.
He's not a Republican. That's his appeal.
And not Dr. Oz, I think.
Not Dr. Oz. No, seriously though, because Fetterman, as you may or may not know, he was a Democratic lieutenant governor. He had a serious stroke some months ago, and now he can't hear when people speak to him. His brain can't process this. He has to depend on a video screen to see the words of the person speaking to him written down. He was in the debate you saw. He did one debate with his opponent, Dr. Mehmet Oz, and it was a disaster because he's not fit physically for office. But I think the reason he's still ahead slightly in the polls is because he's a Democrat, not a Republican. Similarly, in the state of Georgia, you have an incumbent senator, Raphael Warnock, African-American pastor, who's very woke, running against a black former star athlete, Herschel Walker, who is on the Republican side. But Walker has been a disaster of a candidate in so many ways. He's just been a hot mess, but he's still competitive because he's not a Democrat.
Republican, you mean?
No, well, yeah,
He's not a Republican.
He's a Republican, which is to say he's not a Democrat. If I were in the state of Georgia, I would hold my nose and vote for Herschel Walker, even though I think he's unfit for office, because I want the Republicans to win.
But
the
I think
Senate.
that's an important, how should I say, point you make, because I think in these two states, the Republican candidates are pretty weak. Dr. Oz is not the brightest mind on the earth, sadly, and the football player is. I don't want to offend him, but perhaps even worse in this sense. So I think those candidates are sadly pretty weak compared to the Democrat one. But I think the debate will change the Pennsylvania race, because it really showed. I feel sorry for the guy, because of course he had a stroke. But I do agree looking at that debate, but I'm not sure. I had a feeling that he's a bit like Biden, and because with Biden you have these issues.
Well, it makes Biden sound like Churchill.
Yes, but I think because a lot of people have this feeling that Biden is not fit for office, the poor Biden, because he had a stroke, a lot of people will think, we already have Biden, so why would we need a senator who is pretty similar.
So I think there's no better closing line than that makes Biden look like Churchill. I did not think we can use that over here. But fundamentally, what István and Rod really get at is some of the underlying attributes of U.S. politics, that it's all not just the party, although in some instances party trumps candidate, but in certain races it's key that the candidate's potential is at least a larger allure than the party itself. So we'll see interesting things, and I think we highlighted some of the key themes of the debate. And if there are no other questions, then there's one more question. All right, John, please.
I agree very broadly with your pessimistic assessment of the Democrat chances. It looks very bad. At the same time, it's worse than even that, because it looks again as though they're going to lose from the people they rely on absolutely to win. They'll probably lose some black votes instead of getting 92%. They are losing Hispanic votes, they're losing Asian votes. So the multiracial coalition of the Democrats is not doing well, and the extreme white liberals, who opinion polls now isolate as a group, and it shows that they actually have views on racial questions which are more anti-white than those of any of the minorities. So they will lose, and possibly lose very badly, but they will still control the executive, and they will still dominate all the major media, cultural, and corporate institutions. So what do you think they're going to do in the 2 years before the presidential election?
Oh, they're going to go crazy, and they're going to become even more extreme. Look, this is one of the reasons that I'm here in Hungary now. I've developed such an interest in Hungary, because you have a conservative government that seems to understand the importance of institutional power in ways that our Republicans don't. So I would certainly hope that the Republicans, if they do win the Congress, will get a lot smarter about the way they deal with the institutions of the media and other institutions, and realize that the ruling class, the regime, as a lot of us call them, or the cathedral, really are lined up against them and will pull out every possible line of attack against the Republicans. And I wish the Republicans would come up with an actual vision. They've gone back to the Reagan well so many times over the years, because it was a very powerful vision of one I agreed with, and I do agree with, but it's also 40 years old. I don't see why it's so hard for the Republicans to stand up on basic American principles of fairness, judging people by the content of their character and their willingness to work hard, and attack woke capitalism, but also attack these liberals who are turning our country, who are balkanizing our country. I just talked the other day to a professor down in Sarajevo who said to me, why is your country doing this? Why are your leaders turning everybody against each other on the basis of race and sexuality and all that? Don't they know where this is going to go? And he's talking to me from Sarajevo. This is a powerful story the Americans could tell, the Republicans could tell, one that I think could propel them to the White House and beyond for the next few years if they would get their act together and quit being so cowardly about attacking wokeness.
I think that's a pretty bleak picture of what's to come if there's certain things that are left unchanged in U.S. politics, societal, economic, and all other things as well. And man needs no introduction. John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute, thank you so much for that great question. I think with that, we'll sort of wrap up. It's about the end of our time. So I want to thank again all our panelists, István Kiss, Rod Dreher, István Stumpf, and thank you all for being here. And we'll hang around a little longer if you have any questions for us, but let's give them a nice round of applause. And then... All that's left for me to say is thank you for coming. Thank you for Scruton for hosting us. And if you're interested in listening to the most eloquent speaker on offensive realism, Mearsheimer, Rod mentioned he's coming next week, and he's speaking at the University of Public Service as well on great power politics and their tragedy. So thanks again. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.